Good evening and welcome to episode 2 of The Lockdown with me, your host, Ricardo, an ordinary guy in a not so ordinary situation. Right, so how was your second day of lockdown? I'm hoping it was slightly better than the first and slightly less stressful than the build-up to get there. I must say, for me, it definitely has settled down a little bit more with regards to the feeling of otherworldliness, of anxiety. Obviously, as things progress, hopefully there will be a sense of that permeates our entire country and the world. I hope wherever you're listening to this from, that if you are finding yourself in a state where your life has been disrupted quite dramatically, that you're also doing all right, and know that you are not alone, and that it is not in any way a reflection on your capacity as a human being or as your worth as a person if you're finding it difficult. So keep on going. I'm finding that doing sort of regular things around the home, one of the advantages is my dishwasher had been broken for a number of weeks before this lockdown occurred. So having to hand wash dishes is something that I actually like quite a lot. There's a level at which I think civilizations, many cultures around the world and humanity in general, when you look at people trying to find stillness in their minds, they turn to something like simple physical activity. Because there's something in that sort of repetition and having a sense of purpose, and also having a sense of completion. When you have a whole stack of dirty dishes and you wash them all, then they're all done and you feel better about yourself, right? So enough about my dishwashing fetish. I also have one about vacuum cleaners. I really like vacuum cleaners and I like vacuuming. But that's maybe something to go into on another day. So I do hope that your day went better. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm completely fascinated by the numbers, by the facts and figures and statistics of this entire thing. And it came to me in this thought where I had this thought where, you know how everybody that can now wears a smartwatch of one form or another. And it's this idea of tracking and monitoring data. And never has it been more important than when the data really could mean the difference between success and failure. And I wanted to look at South Korea, because Korea has been one of the few countries, it's mostly Eastern countries, in fact all Eastern countries in the East, that have had more success in terms of containing and keeping their internal infection rates lower. And they've also managed to deal with things a little bit differently, which has ultimately resulted in them coping a little bit more than what you're seeing now in the West and in the southern hemisphere. So what I want to discuss is, and I've got some notes here, so please excuse me if I'm fumbling around a little bit. I was watching an interview today with the top specialist in South Korea who is responsible for the entire sort of infectious disease center. And this gentleman has over 30 years of experience in this particular realm of medicine. And one of the things that was so interesting was what his opinion around why South Korea, China, places like Hong Kong, why are these places finding it easier to deal with this reality? And that was one of the first things I thought about, because every country is different, and that's something he mentions, is that every single country is going to deal with their particular challenge, in this case the outbreak. They're going to deal with it in slightly different ways, sometimes drastically different ways, based on obviously their capacity financially, their average level of technological integration, so how tech savvy, how integrated are their lives around technology. That's going to give them the benefit of being able to do that, to use that. Obviously, there'll be cultural norms which have to be broken. There'll be religious rulings or rules, things that have to change or cannot be changed. There'll be socioeconomic and also cultural behavioral standards and norms that will be make it easier or more difficult to to sort of control something like a disease that's spreading throughout a country. So the first thing that he said, which for me was just so logical and without this information, and I'd like to touch on this topic a little bit later, but he is an expert with 3 decades worth of knowledge. And in an age where everybody's getting their 5 cents or they're getting their 5 cents worth of news and they're putting their 5 cents worth of opinion out there on the internet, there's been a flagrant disregard often for experts, because every second person is now an expert on something. That the sort of couch coach of a soccer team, or the couch boxing instructor, and then there's also the couch politician and the couch medical professional. And I think one thing we cannot disregard is that at a time of crisis where it really counts, we need people who know what they're talking about. It's that simple, not opinion based, actual hard scientific, studied, has the piece of paper to prove it, and then has got years of experience behind them and has seen. And this is the big one, is that this gentleman speaks of how in South Korea, this is not the first of this kind of disease that's spread through their country. They were very well baptized in 2003 with SARS. They then had in 2009 some swine flu. And in 2015, they had the MERS outbreak. So the big thing that he's saying there is that the reason they could respond so quickly is because they've had this before. They have had this experience before. And Western countries, and South Africa included, has not. In terms of epidemics that have existed, they have been quite localized. Their death rates have been very high. So essentially, if you take something like the SARS outbreak, that's an interesting one. The SARS outbreak that happened in 2003, across the entire SARS outbreak, there were 8,000 people infected. But it killed around 720 or 724 people, which is a 9.6% death rate. Now, the advantage with SARS, even though SARS is not a very pleasant thing, is that every single person who gets it shows symptoms. That's a huge, huge, massive difference. This is a far sneakier, a far more difficult enemy. And this is what he outlined. He said in his 30 years, which obviously made me feel rather afraid, in his 30 years of dealing with things like this, epidemics, pandemics, he feels that this is the most challenging of any of the sort of outbreaks that he has seen, because of this idea. And when you look at their numbers, and we're going to go through those, they have some of the most accurate data points and sets available because they've done the most testing. Nobody comes close to their testing. And this is one of the things. So they're doing 15,000 tests a day and have tested over 330,000 people to date. It's massive. So they're doing 15,000 tests a day, which means out of 338,000 or so people, they are able to give data which makes a lot of sense because their pool is so great. As opposed to if you only have 200 people, then breaking that down into categories and ages, and that doesn't work as well. So look at the death rate here. So of their cases, if you're over 80, they saw 11.6% of people die if you're over 80. People in their 70s, they saw 6.3%. In their 60s, 1.5%. Then as soon as you hit your sort of 50s, you had 0.4%, your 30s, 0.1%, so your 30s and 40s, 0.1%, and then your 20s and teens and below that, 0. They had no deaths at all in that range of 20s and below. So one of the interesting things there is that this illness it kills a whole bunch of people over a certain age. The problem with it is not so much when you hear that, like, oh, if you're in your 70s, only 6.3% chance of dying. The problem is how many people in that bracket can be infected within a short period of time without knowing it, and then it incubates and stays around for a week and a half. Most people start feeling symptoms within sort of 5 to 7 days of the infection. It's not as long as 2 weeks, mostly on average. But Korea were very well prepared for this. Where did they get all these tests from, and how are they able to do it so quickly? So their average test takes 6 hours. That's it, 6 hours. If there's a whole bunch of tests, it may take a day, it may take 12 hours. But the thing is, they had, after their first and second outbreaks, they developed these testing kits, which were very effective, very accurate, and very cost effective. Because ultimately what he said was that it was in companies who developed these things, it was in their financial interest to do so, because the first people who could bring these things to market were going to make a ton of money. And the government would buy them up, and private medical facilities would need these things, and they knew that the first person to get there, the first group to get there, would be making the money. So there was an incentive, and so they were ready for this because they knew they had it before. Now, for every other country short of these, and short of the ones that had a slight brushing with SARS as well, everybody else got caught, completely sideswiped, with the speed at which this disease spreads, with the nature of it, and how exponential mathematics works. So the way in which things sort of double and then double again and double again and double again every few days. And we're seeing that in New York right now. They are reporting a doubling of infections every 2 to 3 days. So that becomes quite astronomical very, very quickly. For me, this whole thing, imagine, where were you a week ago, right? 2 weeks ago, where were you then? And it's the same across the world. People are sort of just lost the speed, the rapidness of their change of their lives. The good news is that you can adapt to it, but the bad news is that it's changed. That's the difficult part. So going back to Korea, they were very well prepared for this. Now, one of the things that was asked of him was, what sort of time frames do you foresee? Everybody wants to know, right? From the American president saying, oh, you'll be ready for Easter, we'll just open up and we'll be ready, through to people saying that this is going to take a little longer than we expect. And I think one of the things that are so critical at a time of trauma, because that is what this is to be very realistic and always play towards the worst case and most difficult case scenario, because then you can be pleasantly surprised when it isn't that bad. But this is what he said. With regards to SARS being a really good, a good sort of a waypoint for us. So SARS broke out and really came to the fore in November of 2002, around there. And it only affected, and I'm saying only in relation to what we see here, it affected 8,000 people, 724 of them died. So that was in November 2002. It was sort of under control and eliminated by July of 2003. So you're looking at a November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. And that was only for 8,000 infections that were easily identifiable because they all show symptoms. And that actually makes it a lot simpler to contain and control, which is what happened. We're looking at specific cities reaching 8,000 infections and way beyond that. Those are only cities. We're looking at, and the other thing he pointed out is that air travel, we live in a borderless world. Isn't that an interesting one? That even though you can go to any country and there's some sort of border control, even there, let's say you stopped at a border, at a checkpoint, at a gateway, there's still people from the other side who interact with you, who check your passports, who talk to you, who look in your bags, who come into close contact with you. So even though you might not enter a country successfully, you may very well bring with you some very difficult and challenging guests that enter another country. So when SARS broke out, he just pointed out that traveling via air is so much more exponentially has increased to the point where really you cannot sort of contain, it only takes 1 or 2 people to fly around And there you go. There you have a whole other system of reinfection. And this is something else he said, because there's a myth where if you've been infected, you cannot be infected again. And he said that's absolutely not the case. They're seeing the exact opposite. It's early days for this. I mean, 3 months for this. This is all the time they've had to study this brand new virus. But he has seen personally of cases of people who leave. They then go out into communities where they're still practicing, social distancing and fairly good hygiene. They all wear masks, by the way, all of them, and there's reasons for that. And it's interesting that they raised that he raised that, and I'll touch on that. But he said he's seen, in 2 weeks, people show symptoms again, and they're reinfected. So please, that myth of, oh, well, I've had it, or maybe you think you've had it, and so you can't get reinfected, so it's totally safe for you to go out and be a little bit less cautious. That is not the case at all. And that's the other thing, is that he was saying in South Korea, 30% of people, 30% of them were sort of in their 20s, and around that age range, 20%, to 20 to 30% of them were asymptomatic. So they had no symptoms, and they are what people refer to as super spreaders or super infectors or super carriers. They go out into a community, into an environment, they don't feel any different. They feel perfectly strong and healthy and fine. They might show very mild signs of feeling tired on a day or something, and then they are super spreaders. They give it to so many people because they move so freely. There's no restriction on their own bodily functions. They don't feel like they should do anything differently, and then they give it to everyone. And that's one of the things that they've experienced, is that the young community in their country has been, a lot of them have been asymptomatic, and because of that they've spread it. So that's another interesting thing. With regards to a vaccine time frame, this is another interesting one. So he said there's going to be 3 sort of possible scenarios, right? The first scenario is that people, that this thing becomes like a seasonal thing. So everyone in the southern hemisphere now starts getting this thing, and then as things shift a bit, people from the southern hemisphere travel to the northern hemisphere in different seasons, and then you have the cyclical thing of where there's now in the northern hemisphere, it flares up again, and then it's an exchange the whole time, kind of like the flu in a way. It's one sort of scenario until a vaccine comes along. Or there's also obviously the idea that you can control this thing if you're testing. You can keep this thing sort of low key until a vaccine comes along. There's also that kind of scenario. But vaccines in general take 10 to 15 years for a new virus to be completely ready to go out into the world at large. So yes, they're talking about it being 18 months. That 18 months of trial and error and so on, if it's absolutely perfect, if everything runs absolutely smoothly, with absolutely no hitches, and for example with a vaccine, what they do is they use like a group of 45 people, healthy, strong young people. They introduce the vaccine into the body, and then they have to check whether this doesn't actually cause issues, makes you more ill, and then they'll take a bigger group after that. It's the second stage, and then there's a third stage. And if all 3 of those stages were absolutely perfect, then it would take 18 months, or maybe a little longer. In the meantime, what can be done is to reappropriate drugs that might be useful in other areas. And an example of this was fascinating. He spoke of drugs being used that were ultimately meant for people with heart conditions. Viagra was actually something which was for pulmonary arteries and restriction and relaxation of those blood vessels and for the heart. And ultimately the side effect thereof was that it solved erectile dysfunction. So there are some drugs they're looking at, malaria-based drugs, things which may help, but ultimately those also have side effects and have to be thought of very carefully. But yes, and then there's the most striking one. There's a scenario where he says, if all the countries affected had to work together completely in harmony and synergy, completely 110%, then we might get rid of this thing by July or August, but there's a 10% chance of us getting it right. There's a 10% chance, and it hinges on the fact that we can all work together in complete harmony, synchronicity, no hitches, no obstacles, nothing like that. And he also pointed out the fact that we're treating the problem and trying to research it at the same time makes it very difficult, because ultimately, as you get data, you have to give it to various people. There's people who are on the ground right now who need to be working on the back end eventually. There are people now on the floor looking after sick people, helping sick people, but they also have to do research and development. So this becomes very, very difficult. But why South Korea has really succeeded is because they've got previous experience, and because of that, they are testing on a massive, massive scale. They also have a process where if you get tested for free. If you're suspected of being ill, the government will test you, and if you come up negative, they give that to you completely for free. They pay for the test because they basically see it as something they have to do, and it's in the best interest of the country, so they will foot the bill for the test. They also have mobile testing stations. You drive through, they swab you, you get your test results. That way you quickly know. There's also these little phone booths. You can basically rock up at these rows of little booths. You go into one, you get seen by somebody, they test you. What they are working on, and this is something that Bill Gates Foundation is working on, is a self-testing kit that can be done at home. And this is going to change things tremendously, because right now it takes a healthcare professional donned in full protective gear, of which almost, very few countries have enough of this stuff, especially South Africa. I mean, it's one of the scary things. And you can do it at home, and you can get a result, and this is going to help people a lot because they'll know where they stand. And this is one of the things that keeps coming up for me, and I keep hearing this from multiple experts, is you cannot fight an enemy that you cannot see, and the only way to see it is to test for it. And you cannot just test people because they have symptoms. You also have to test people who think they do. You have to test people who simply want to be tested because they believe they should be. So one of the things that they've done is they've massively been able to do that because of their experience. And then what they do is, and this is an amazing process, is that, let's say, for example, someone's coming into the country. What they do there is they first test the person entering the country. If that person tests negative, they say, cool, you get to go on your way. However, you are self-quarantining for 2 weeks. If you're positive, obviously, then you get quarantined in a specific space. And if you show symptoms and you are ill, you go and get hospitalized. So that they try and track every single one of those cases, because every single one can create so many more. And this is the challenge, is that, yes, a lockdown, which in our case is something which we will struggle with for a while, and I think there are reasons for that I have some thoughts about. A lockdown is from the top down. So you have this force, let's say, on the virus, which is top down, and we're weighing down on it. Then from the bottom, you got to give it an equal amount of force to crush this thing, which is the testing, the isolating, the following up. So what happens is the person who is found not positive, who has to self-quarantine, they have an app installed onto their phone, and that app tells and tracks everybody that has passed through the gates there, and they go through into the quarantining of themselves, and then they have to report twice a day of their symptoms. It checks where they go, their movements, and the specialist did say, yes, this is a invasion of privacy for the greater good of a country. And that is one of the reasons why that kind of system would not work in a country like the United States. It wouldn't from a cultural perspective. Being tracked, your movements being tracked. There's already a history and a sensitivity around that in the United States and in many other countries. But in a case like this, how effective it is, plus their entire economy, their entire payment structures, they pay for everything using their phones and using their apps on their phones. So they have already been very deeply ingrained in using their technology, and all it needed was a a platform, an app that could then help them in that regard, because every single person is using that. People do not carry cash. They just pay. And whether you're a street vendor on the side of the road, you've got a little QR code, people scan it to pay you, goes to your bank account. So it's a very different structure. And that's something I wanted to talk about. And that is, as South Africans, we, and I talk very generalized here, please excuse me if I'm talking to someone in the audience that's listening that isn't like this, but as a South African nation, we despise authority. We reel against it. Have you ever met that kind of guy who he's drunk? He decides he's going to drive his car on a Saturday night. No, I'm good. I've just had 52,000 beers, and he gets stopped at a roadblock. And his complaint the next day, if he was arrested, if he didn't try and pay a bribe and the officials did their job and they took him in and, put him in a cell, his complaint will be, yeah, but they normally never have a roadblock there. They never have a roadblock there, bro. Right? They're more angry about the fact that something different has happened rather than they've been busted for something that could have killed other people. And the same thing happens with teachers that there's a level at which teachers in quite a number of environments are sort of, the authority is challenged and pushed against. It isn't the East. It isn't China. That does not happen in the same way there. And I have some experience of working with Chinese companies quite deeply and working closely with people. And that is just not the case. It's really unheard of, because there's a massive sense of personal, a kind of familial and personal pride, which if you're singled out or asked to keep quiet or asked to stand up or have any kind of reprimand, you bring shame upon your family. And that's really deeply rooted in their culture. So their level of social cohesion and obedience is very high. Now, whether that's through fear, propaganda, etc., it's the desire to comply is very high in the countries that have succeeded. Our country, South Africa, America, the UK, these are not places that particularly like being told what to do and when to do it and how to do it. So the fact that I've seen numbers of photographs today of places which look very empty, very abandoned, to me was spectacular, because I know how difficult that is for a country that just wants to do the opposite just because it got told to do something. Stand up. No, I'm sitting. I don't really care. Well, there's a nail on the seat. No, I'm sitting down. I'm not gonna stand up. There's that level of rebelling, and it makes sense historically, because our country was sort of thrown into this mad world of oppressive, historically oppressive regime, established military regime that would tell the greater population what to do. Gosh, can you even imagine that? That's insanity. So I imagine a lot of those feelings would be coming up for people who lived through that. I think that must be really, really hard. The last time you were told you couldn't go somewhere, or what time you could go somewhere, or when you should or shouldn't, the last time that happened, you were not free. You were not free. The country was not free to be. That must be crazy. And so difficult. And that's the other thing I came across today, which is we're on day 2, and a lot of people, a lot of the working class, who had no time to buy groceries, who do not get paid randomly and do not have savings and are not able to go to the shops whenever they feel like it, as they don't have independent transport. These people that build the very basic foundations of our country are put in a position where they have to queue closely, go to whichever shopping areas they're able to reach, which are usually very crowded, and they are forced to stand in rows, not because they want to, but because they're also afraid. Everybody is. And there's a real... For me, it's and it will get better. it will get better. But I mean, there's a level at which people show such disdain for that. I've seen that quite a lot, where people are very upset. How is it that people cannot be enforcing these rules? How is it that they cannot be standing in the lines between 1.5 meters, 1 meters apart from each other, and all of that kind of stuff? And people are very, very upset seeing these images. And yet the funny thing is, and I suppose I really should I really should draw the line here between the massive disparity in our country between people who have and people who don't. And we're very similar to a number of countries. And I think Brazil is probably really close in terms of its in terms of that dynamic. Is that it's so ironic, because less than a week before this, the middle class went on buying sprees where they sat on top of each other and probably spread it to one another beautifully in much the same way, because they were buying toilet paper and other things they deemed essential. That's why. It wasn't better. It wasn't at all. So it's so funny. It's like we have to break the cycle of thinking that because someone has less or has a different way of, or a different accented way of speaking English, that their ideas are somehow flawed. That is something we're really going to need to work on. And what's really strange to me is the fact that a disease can bring an entire world to its knees and make us realize how interconnected we are. But on a micro level, we're still separating ourselves according to various classes and class systems and educational systems and all that kind of stuff. And for me, that's just crazy. It's going to take time. And you know what? I think we can actually breathe a little bit, because there's no way this is going away by April. There's no way. Just the numbers make no sense. The numbers until, and the specialist spoke about it. So he spoke about it being so important that when the numbers go down, that's when you can start looking. That's when you can start looking. Levels of infection, as numbers are still going up, there's no worry or reason to start thinking you're going to, go out into the world and go watch a movie and go to a restaurant and hang out with your buddies. It's not happening. And I think if we can get our minds around that, we can all breathe and calm down and know this is going to last a while. It doesn't mean that anybody wants it to. And I, for one, surely don't take pleasure in the fact that it is. But there's something empowering to go, wow, okay, so we're in this indefinite cycle for now. We're here now. So now let's use this to open our eyes and see where the hell we are. What has happened? I just realized that. It's so crazy that you spend all your life working and working and working and waiting for a time where you have enough money so you don't have to work as much, and then by that time you're whatever age, and then you go, oh, okay, there it is. That's the narrative of life. And this is going to bring into question so many of those things. We can actually breathe, we can actually think just for a moment, just to go, gosh, what's going on around us? And this may be the catalyst needed. The world needed something to shift, and things have been good. So good. The world has been in such a great place. It's like you talk to anybody who's in their 60s and 70s, they'll tell you about hardship. They'll tell you about someone I like to listen to on YouTube. He refers to it as being punched in the face. Like the world will punch you in the face. And many people in their 30s and 40s, they haven't had that. They haven't been punched in the face properly. Really and truly, economy, from an economical perspective, from just living in the world, every generation has had its challenges. And this may be our very first real one. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. But there are obviously countries that have managed to do so. But I often, you hear of it and you go, oh, well, we can't do it because we're South African and we suck. Or they can do it because this and that. But there's real reasons for it. When you have experience, you can do better. We don't. We have absolutely no experience. Neither does America, neither does England. So we're all similarly sitting in that boat. Now, obviously with a bit more money and specialization and training, yes, these things can be helpful and shortened. And If you want to see some really interesting visualizations, so over the past few weeks, there have been quite a number of really great articles which have come out which visualize infections and that kind of thing. But today I came across a particularly interesting one. If you go onto YouTube and you search for simulating an epidemic, really phenomenally interesting. People are putting together these visualizations, and so interesting because it's hard for us to hold in our heads what's actually happening. And there's some really, really smart people who are able to show it to us in images. And that really helps to understand where we're at. The challenge we have in our country, obviously, is education, is knowledge, is an average level of understanding. And that is going to take us a heck of a lot longer than other countries. It's fine because that is the truth of it. That is the truth of it. That is not an indication that we're stupid. That's just an indication that we have shortages when it comes to being able to do that and do that well and have that become the average, is that people are educated enough to understand some of these ideas. And in the meantime, we've got to support each other. In the meantime, we've got to be there for each other. We've got to help each other. Otherwise, we'll never get to that point. So I'm going to post the link to this visualization video. It's a 23-minute video, very, very worthwhile watching. Really, really interesting. I was so taken back about it. When I was younger, I was really sucked at maths, and I was on functional grade, right? For those of you who were around back then, functional grade, where you get given a little piece of paper with a test, and then on there would be the equations. You never had to memorize and hold them in your head, and I still sucked terribly and failed. So even with that help, but this, taking the data points, putting it out into a visual medium like a simulation where you can see things, really helps to give you a feeling of a sense of understanding of what's going on, a sense of, yes, there's an inevitability of what was going to happen. Like New York now, they're gearing up for a certain inevitable loss of life, which doesn't make it any easier. It's just to understand that this was a very short, sharp, and sudden thing that, yes, people murmured about, yes, people spoke about, everything in hindsight. But the countries who are going to deal with it the best are people who've had actual experience on the ground. Coming back to that point about masks, now that I remember, the specialist said that mask wearing is part of lowering infections, because if you are, and I know that the World Health Organization has said, don't wear a mask unless you're sick or unless you're dealing with a sick. Part of that is because there is a worldwide shortage of masks. So you don't want private individuals to buy up massive amounts, and then healthcare workers really need to have first priority. But in South Korea, everyone wears a mask because masks work. Masks stop you from getting infected as easily, and they stop you passing it on as easily. It's just sensical, because if that wasn't the case, if masks didn't work, then doctors and nurses wouldn't be wearing them. It's like, for him, it's a no-brainer. So I know that there have been studies that have shown even wrapping a simple cloth or scarf around your face is better than nothing. And that is true. Something is better than nothing in every single metric. But coming from a country that's actually managing this really, really well, if you are able to wear some kind of protection when you go out, that is advisable. It is advisable because you do not know if you're sick anyway. You don't know. You could be in that 20%. So what it looks like in terms of mortality rate, when you take countries that have got some data and you sort of squeeze it all together, it looks like of people who get this, about 1% and a bit of them will die. So the percentage itself is not very high, but the toll on everything else, the strain it puts on everything is so huge, and that is exactly what it is. So, yeah, there are countries that have the experience. There are countries that manage it better because of their knowledge and because they've integrated their lifestyles. The way that they integrate technology was so much a part of who they are already. Their backgrounds, the fact that they're quite socially compliant. The entire framework was set up for that. There may be challenges you would throw at a country like that would struggle, because they would require the complete opposite of their sort of their thesis, so to speak. Their vibe is so different, and they would struggle with that. Where we may find ourselves with a challenge as a country which we don't find too difficult, but others might. So the big thing is to realize that we are all in it. We're all in the same boat, even those with experience. And let's make peace with the fact that this can last a lot longer and will last a lot longer than what anybody would like. Because then you can say, oh, okay, well, if we are able to bring that down, if things turn around for the better, and that is not as long, great. But if you gear your mind up to go, oh, well, 21 days from now, I'm out of here. I'm out of this house. Can't wait for it to be done. Then I think that sets you up for a very painful emotional experience when the numbers themselves would make no sense. As long as our infection numbers are increasing, there would be no logical reason to try and say that this thing is going to go away, or that we are going to find ourselves just assuming business as usual. It makes no sense. So instead of getting all depro about it, we could, but we don't need to. We can actually just look it square in the face and go, cool, that's what we are going to face, and let's face it. And we will adapt to this new life. So I'd love to hear from you if what your second day was like. Please feel free to leave any comments. Feel free to message me, and I just appreciate the opportunity to put out my thoughts. And for those of you that found any value in this, I appreciate that too. I wish you the best of luck. I hope that day 3 tomorrow brings with it a new and another level of calm, acceptance. I think that's going to be a big word, acceptance, because there's a lot we cannot control. There's a lot that the only areas we can really work on are the practical advices we've been given from experts, and then our own minds and our own sort of ways in which we see the world. So be open to that shift. Yeah, well, at least I'm talking for myself. I'm really talking to myself here. Be open to that shift. Be open to the fact that things have changed. And I wish you all a wonderful evening until next time. Thanks again, and goodbye.